A 7-year-old boy stood in the howling Wyoming snowstorm, his small hands trembling as they clutched a heavy metal dog collar. Around him, 6 German shepherds formed a perfect protective circle, their dark forms barely visible against the white chaos of wind and ice. The collar's inner lining gleamed in the dim light, revealing coordinates etched into the metal, coordinates that pointed to a truth buried deeper than the snow beneath his feet. For 7 years, Ethan Cole hadn't spoken a single word. For 7 years, these 6 dogs had never left his side, watching, guarding, waiting. The town called him the Silent Boy, but they didn't know why he was silent. They didn't know what he'd seen. They didn't know that his father, a police officer everyone believed was dead, had left him more than memories. What Ethan found in that collar would bring a dead man back from hell itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Silver Point, Wyoming, wasn't so much a town as it was a memory refusing to fade. Nestled in the mountains 85 miles from the nearest city, this former mining settlement had once thrived with 2,000 souls chasing gold and dreams. Now, in the winter of 2025, barely 200 remained, most of them over 60, clinging to the houses their grandparents built, watching their town die one snowy season at a time. The cold here wasn't just weather, it was a presence. From November through March, temperatures plunged to 40 below, and snow piled so high against the weathered buildings that some homes disappeared entirely until spring. The town sat isolated, cut off from the world for weeks at a time when storms rolled through the mountain passes. It was the kind of place people left, not the kind they came to. But for those who stayed, Silver Point was more than home. It was sacred ground where memories lived in every creaking floorboard and frost-covered window. Ethan Cole lived on the eastern edge of town in a small wooden house that had seen better decades. At 7 years old, he was an anomaly in Silver Point, a child in a town of ghosts and grandparents. He had sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead, gray eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for someone so young, and a silence that had defined him since he was 4 months old. The town had learned not to expect words from Ethan. They'd learned to read his expressions, his gestures, the way his small shoulders would hunch when frightened or relax when the dogs were near, and the dogs were always near. 6 German shepherds followed Ethan everywhere, to school, to the small general store, even to church on Sundays when Margaret dragged him along. Gunnar was the eldest at 9, a magnificent beast with a blind left eye and a collar that seemed heavier than necessary. Lady, 8 years old with a scarred face, never left Ethan's bedside at night. Bear, the largest at 95 pounds, positioned himself at doorways like a furry sentinel. Duchess patrolled constantly, her route so predictable you could set your watch by it. Scout stayed within arm's reach of Ethan at all times, and Ghost, white as the snow that buried Silver Point each winter, moved like a phantom, silent but ever present. The townspeople had theories, of course. Old Agnes Murphy, who lived next door, swore the dogs were guardian angels in disguise. Reverend Thomas Whitmore suggested they were God's way of protecting the innocent. The children at school, less charitable, called Ethan the Wolf Boy and kept their distance. But no one knew the truth, that these 6 dogs were keeping a promise made 7 years ago by a man everyone believed was dead. Margaret Maggie Cole, who everyone knew as Ethan's aunt and guardian, watched the boy and his canine shadows from the kitchen window each morning, her 60-year-old hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold, and wondered how much longer she could maintain the lie that kept them all alive. The morning of January 15th began, like every other morning in the Cole household, with ritual and silence. Ethan woke at 6:30 to find Lady's warm body pressed against his side, her scarred muzzle resting on his pillow. Bear lay across the doorway, a living barrier between the boy and whatever dangers the world might hold. Through the frosted window, Ethan could see Duchess completing her patrol of the property, her breath forming white clouds in the -15-degree air. Maggie had breakfast waiting, oatmeal with brown sugar, toast, and weak tea. She set 2 bowls on the table, one for herself and one for Ethan, then filled 6 metal dishes with kibble for the dogs. It was always the same. She would try to make conversation, asking questions that required only nods or head shakes. "Did you sleep well?" Nod. "Any homework today?" Shake. "Cold enough for you?" A slight shrug that might have meant anything or nothing at all. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people sharing space but not lives, of obligations met but connections missed. Maggie's gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, her nurse's uniform from years past replaced by worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had belonged to her brother. She looked older than 60, her face lined with worries she couldn't speak aloud, and secrets that pressed down on her shoulders like physical weight. Ethan ate mechanically, his eyes fixed on something Maggie couldn't see. Some middle distance where the past and present blurred together. When he finished, he carefully rinsed his bowl, dried it, and placed it in the exact same spot in the cupboard where it had lived for 7 years. The dogs waited patiently, then followed him to his small bedroom where he would dress for school. The walk to Silver Point Elementary was only 4 blocks, but it might as well have been a gauntlet. The 6 dogs flanked Ethan in a formation so precise it seemed choreographed. Gunner in front, Scout and Bear on the flanks, Duchess ranging ahead, Lady at his left heel, and Ghost bringing up the rear. Other children gave them wide berth, whispering and pointing. Their parents watched from windows, shaking their heads at the strange sight of the silent boy and his impossible pack. At school, the dogs took up positions in the snowy yard, visible through the classroom windows. Mrs. Patricia Henderson, who'd taught 2nd grade for 34 years, had long ago stopped trying to separate Ethan from his watchers. She'd learned that the boy functioned better knowing they were there, that he'd panic if he couldn't see them, that the dogs were as much a part of him as his own shadow. "Ethan," she said gently during reading time, "would you like to share your picture with the class?" The boy looked down at his notebook. While other children had drawn houses and families and pets, Ethan's pencil had created something darker, a man with a gun, another man falling, and in the corner 6 dogs pulling something through darkness. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered. She'd seen these drawings before, variations on the same disturbing theme. She'd called Maggie about them twice. Maggie had said they were just nightmares, nothing to worry about. Boys will be boys. But Mrs. Henderson worried anyway. At 3 o'clock, Ethan emerged from the building to find his 6 guardians exactly where he'd left them, snow dusting their dark coats. The walk home was uneventful until they passed the post office, where Maggie stood talking to Edgar Mills, the postmaster. Her face was pale, her hands clutching an official-looking envelope. When she saw Ethan, she quickly stuffed the letter in her coat pocket, but not before he glimpsed the words stamped in red, "Final Notice." That evening, Maggie cooked dinner in silence, chicken and potatoes, simple and cheap. She kept glancing at the envelope on the counter, then at Ethan, then at the 6 dogs who lay in a semicircle around the boy's chair. The weight of unspoken things filled the small kitchen like smoke. When Ethan went to bed at 8, Maggie remained at the kitchen table, the envelope open before her. $47,000 owed to the bank. 5 days until foreclosure, no job for 3 years, no savings, no hope. She looked at the calendar on the wall where she'd been crossing off days with red X's. 7 years of X's. 7 years of waiting, hiding, protecting. 7 years of living a lie so complete that sometimes she forgot who she really was. She touched her abdomen, where a faint scar remained hidden beneath her clothes, a scar that told a truth no one in Silver Point knew. The dogs knew, though. They'd always known. They'd been there from the beginning, witnesses to everything, keeping secrets as faithfully as they kept watch. Maggie wondered, as she did every night, how much longer she could hold the pieces together before everything she'd built came crashing down around them. She didn't know that tomorrow a man from the past would arrive and set in motion the very collapse she feared, or that hidden in Gunner's collar was the key to salvation that had been waiting 7 long years to be found. The black SUV rolled into Silver Point just after noon on January 16th, its engine cutting through the winter silence like a knife. It was the kind of vehicle that didn't belong in a dying town. Too new, too clean, too deliberate. Agnes Murphy, sweeping snow from her porch next door to the Cole house, paused to watch as it crawled down Main Street, then turned onto Birch Avenue where Maggie and Ethan lived. The driver was a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and handsome in the way that made people trust him instinctively. He wore a dark coat and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent years in uniform, commanding respect without demanding it. When he stepped out of the SUV, his breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the property before settling on the small wooden house. Marcus Brennan had returned to Silver Point after 7 years of absence, and he came bearing gifts and lies in equal measure. Maggie answered the door on the third knock, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When she saw who stood on her porch, her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been fear before she settled on a tight smile. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "Maggie." He smiled warmly, holding up a shopping bag from a toy store in Billings. "I know it's been too long. I should have come sooner, checked on you and the boy. Michael was like a brother to me. I owed him that much." Behind Maggie, inside the house, came a sound that made Marcus's smile falter. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from multiple sources at once. Through the partially open door he could see them, 6 sets of eyes, 6 dark forms rising from various positions around the living room, 6 mouths pulling back to reveal teeth. "The dogs remember you," Maggie said, not moving from the doorway. "Dogs have long memories," Marcus replied, his tone still friendly but something shifting in his eyes. "May I come in? It's colder than a grave out here." The unfortunate choice of words hung in the air between them. Maggie hesitated, her hand tightening on the doorframe, but small-town courtesy and the appearance of normalcy won out over instinct. She stepped aside, though not before calling out, "Gunner, Bear, settle." The dogs obeyed, but barely. They remained standing, muscles coiled, eyes locked on Marcus as he entered. It was Gunner who reacted most strongly, the alpha with the blind eye and the unusually heavy collar. He positioned himself directly between Marcus and the hallway where Ethan's room lay, his lips still curled back in a silent snarl. Marcus set the bag on the coffee table, careful to move slowly. "I brought something for Ethan." "Action figures. Boys still like those, right?" He glanced around the modest living room, taking in details with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years looking for things people wanted to hide. "Where is the little guy?" "School," Maggie lied smoothly. Ethan was actually in his room, having stayed home with a cold. "He'll be back around 3:30. "Still not talking, I heard." Marcus settled onto the couch, uninvited, and Lady immediately moved to block his path to the hallway, her scarred face twisted into something between a warning and a promise. "That's rough. 7 years is a long time to be silent." "He's been through trauma," Maggie said, remaining standing. "Losing his father at 4 months old." Right. Marcus nodded sympathetically, but his eyes were searching, cataloging. "Michael's death. Terrible accident. I still think about that night, the ambush, the chaos. I replay it over and over, wondering if I could have saved him. Maggie said nothing, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I was actually wondering, Marcus continued, leaning forward with apparent concern, if Michael ever, I don't know, mentioned anything to you before he died? About work, maybe? Cases he was working on? He was always so secretive about the trafficking investigation. There it was, the real reason for his visit, delivered casual as a comment about the weather. Maggie's poker face held, but Scout, positioned near her leg, pressed closer, sensing her tension. Michael never brought work home, she said. He wanted to protect us from all that ugliness. Of course, of course. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's just that some loose ends from that time are coming up again. Old evidence, old questions. I wanted to make sure you weren't bothered by anyone asking questions, digging around. You've been through enough. I appreciate your concern, Maggie said, moving toward the door in a clear signal that the visit should end. But we're fine. We've built a quiet life here. No one bothers us. Marcus stood slowly, watching as all 6 dogs shifted positions, maintaining their barrier between him and the rest of the house. That's quite a pack you've got. Michael always said these dogs were special. Trained them himself from the fighting ring rescue. Smart animals. Loyal. He paused at the door, looking back at Gunnar. Sometimes I wonder if they know things, if they remember things we think they've forgotten. They're just dogs, Marcus. Right, just dogs. He stepped onto the porch, then turned back. I'm staying at the Silver Point Inn for a few days. Thought I'd visit some old haunts, pay my respects at Michael's grave. Maybe I'll stop by again, meet Ethan properly. It'd be good for him to know his dad's old partner. Maybe, Maggie said non-committally, already closing the door. She watched through the window as Marcus returned to his SUV, but he didn't leave immediately. He sat there for a long moment making a phone call, his expression hardening into something that looked nothing like the concerned friend who'd knocked on her door. When he finally drove away, Maggie released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Behind her, Ethan emerged from his room, his gray eyes wide and knowing. In his hand was his drawing notebook, and he held it up to show Maggie the picture he'd sketched while Marcus was there. The same man from his other drawings, the man with the gun, but now with a face. Marcus's face. The dogs crowded around Ethan, pressing against him in a protective mass. Gunnar looked up at Maggie, and in that one good eye she saw what she'd been denying for years. These animals knew. They remembered. And they'd been waiting for this day, this moment, this threat to resurface. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Maggie made a decision. She went to the kitchen junk drawer and retrieved a small key she'd hidden there 7 years ago, wrapped in a note written in Michael's handwriting. When the time comes, you'll know. She looked at Gunnar, at the collar he'd worn since the day Michael disappeared, and wondered if the time had finally come to discover what secrets had been hiding in plain sight all along. The power went out at 8:47 p.m., plunging the coal house into darkness. Outside, the first major storm of the season had arrived with a vengeance, winds howling through Silver Point's empty streets, snow falling so thick it erased the world beyond the windows. Maggie had prepared. Candles on the mantel, flashlights with fresh batteries, extra firewood stacked by the hearth. But when she lit the fire, and the flames began to dance, casting shadows that moved like living things across the walls, something shifted in the room. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, the 6 dogs arranged around him in their usual protective formation. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were restless. Duchess paced near the windows, her nails clicking on the hardwood. Bear positioned himself at the front door, ears swiveling toward sounds only he could hear. And Gunnar, steady, reliable Gunnar, kept looking at Ethan with an intensity that seemed almost human, almost desperate. The firelight caught something on Gunner's collar, a gleam that Maggie had never noticed before. Or perhaps she'd trained herself not to notice, afraid of what it might mean. Ethan saw it too. His small hand reached out, fingers hovering over the worn leather and metal, and Gunner went completely still. The dog's one good eye locked onto the boy's face, and in that moment something passed between them. Permission, perhaps, or recognition that the 7 years of waiting had reached their end. Ethan's fingers found the buckle, worked it loose with a child's determination. The collar was heavier than it should have been, weighted with something beyond leather and metal. As he turned it over in the firelight, Maggie moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been told never to remove that collar, that it was special, that Gunner needed it. Michael had been insistent about that, the last night she'd seen him alive. The inner lining of the collar had been carefully stitched, but age and wear had loosened one corner. Ethan's small fingers found the gap and pulled. The leather separated to reveal a thin metal plate, and etched into that plate in Michael's precise handwriting were coordinates: N45DG32, W110DG15. Below that, a single word: cabin. And then Ethan spoke. 7 years of silence shattered with a single word, his voice rough and uncertain, barely above a whisper. "Dad?" The 6 dogs erupted, not in chaos, but in coordinated response, all of them standing at once, all of them facing north, all of them with hackles raised and tails rigid. It was like watching soldiers receive orders, like witnessing a switch being flipped. They'd been activated, and they knew exactly what came next. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Ethan! Oh God, Ethan, you spoke!" "You—" But the words died in her throat as she looked at the coordinates. As the implications crashed over her like a wave, she knew those coordinates. She'd memorized them 7 years ago and spent every day since trying to forget them. "How long have you known?" she whispered, not sure if she was asking Ethan or the dogs or the ghost of Michael himself. Ethan looked up at her, those gray eyes suddenly ancient, full of a knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess. "Always," he said, the second word coming easier than the first. I remember everything." Maggie sank to her knees beside him, her carefully constructed world crumbling. "That's impossible. You were 4 months old. Babies don't—" "I remember the night," Ethan continued, words tumbling out now like water from a broken dam. "The shouting, the gunshot, Dad falling, the man—" He pointed toward the door, toward where Marcus had stood hours earlier. "Him, standing over Dad." "I remember Mom screaming, and then the dogs, and then—" He stopped, struggling with memories that seemed to cause physical pain. "And then Mom was gone, and you came, and everyone said different things happened, but I know what I saw." The truth Maggie had buried was surfacing, and there was no stopping it now. She pulled Ethan close, her voice breaking. "Your father made me promise. He said you were too young to understand, that the memories would fade, that by the time you were old enough to comprehend, you'd have forgotten. The silence. We thought it was trauma, making you mute. We thought you didn't remember." "I couldn't forget," Ethan said, his small body trembling. "Every time I tried to talk, I saw it again. Dad told me that night before everything went bad. He told me, if anything happens, don't speak. Don't trust anyone. Wait for the dogs to show you the way." So I waited. Maggie held him at arm's length, searching his face. 7 years. "You've been waiting 7 years?" "The dogs were waiting too," Ethan said simply. "They knew. They've always known. As if in confirmation, Gunnar moved forward and placed his head on Ethan's lap. Lady whimpered softly, pressing against the boy's side. The others maintained their vigilant positions, but there was something different in their posture now. Not just protection, but purpose. Maggie's mind raced. The coordinates pointed to a location near the Canadian border, to an area she and Michael had discussed once in whispers as a contingency, a place to hide, to wait, to survive if the worst happened. She'd thought it was paranoia, the occupational hazard of a cop who'd seen too much darkness, but Michael had been right about so many things. "There's more," she said, the words bitter as ash in her mouth. "Things I've kept from you. Things I've kept from everyone." She stood, moved to the kitchen with Ethan following, the dogs flowing around them like a living tide. From the highest shelf, behind the flour and sugar she rarely used, she retrieved a shoebox sealed with duct tape. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Ethan, all in Michael's handwriting, all marked with dates spanning the 7 years since his death. Maggie had written them herself, imitating Michael's hand from memory, creating a fiction in which a dead man still spoke to his son. But beneath those forgeries lay something else, a single envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with red wax bearing Michael's police badge number. "He gave me this," Maggie said, her hands shaking as she held it. "The night before he died, before we thought he died, he said, 'When Ethan finds the collar, give him this.' Not before. He has to find it himself, or it won't work. The dogs will know when." Ethan took the envelope with a reverence that seemed beyond his years. The wax cracked as he opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper covered in Michael's writing. As he read, his eyes grew wider, filling with tears that reflected the firelight like stars. "Dear son," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you found Gunnar's collar. It means you're old enough to understand. It means the dogs judged the time right. I'm writing this on the last night I'll be Michael Cole, police officer, father, husband. Tomorrow I become something else. A ghost, a memory, a man who has to die to save the people he loves. Marcus Brennan, my partner and brother in all but blood, has been compromised. The trafficking ring we've been investigating has him in their pocket, not through greed, but through love. His son Tyler is sick, desperately sick, and they've promised him money for treatment in exchange for betrayal. Tomorrow night, Marcus will create an accident that will kill me. But I've made arrangements. I'll survive, and I'll disappear, taking evidence with me that will bring down the entire operation when the time is right. Your mother, Aunt Ethan, she is your mother, not your aunt, never your aunt, will tell you she's your guardian because it keeps her safe. The traffickers think she died in childbirth. They think you're the son of my first wife. Let them think it. Let everyone think it. The truth would make you both targets. The coordinates in Gunnar's collar lead to where I'll be waiting. I've prepared a place, supplies for years if necessary. The dogs know the route. I've trained them with commands in German that only you will learn to understand. They'll protect you until you're old enough to come find me. And you will come find me, son. I know you will, because you're brave, like your mother, and smart, like your old man. Trust the dogs more than any human. They've proven themselves 100 times over. They're more than pets. They're soldiers who've chosen you as their mission. When the time comes, they'll lead you home. To me, I love you, Ethan. Every day I'm away from you is torture, but I do this so you can have a future, so your mother can have a life, so the victims we're trying to save can find justice. Wait for the dogs. Trust the dogs. Follow the dogs. Your father, always and forever, Michael Cole. P.S. If Marcus comes looking for you, if he seems nervous or asks about me or searches for something, That's when you know time is running out. The evidence I took is his only leverage to save his son and himself. He'll get desperate. Run, Ethan. Run north. The dogs will show you the way." The letter fluttered from Ethan's hands. Maggie caught it, read it herself, and felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Marcus's visit wasn't nostalgia or concern, it was reconnaissance. He was looking for the evidence, for any trace of where Michael might have hidden it. And now, after 7 years, something had forced his hand. Something had made him desperate enough to risk everything. "He's going to come for us," Ethan said, his newly found voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Isn't he?" Before Maggie could answer, a sound cut through the howling wind. A car engine, struggling through the snow, coming closer. The dogs heard it too, their bodies tensing, low growls rumbling from 6 throats. Duchess ran to the window, then back to Ethan, then to the window again, a clear signal of danger approaching. Maggie moved quickly, blowing out candles, killing the flashlight, leaving only the fire's dim glow. She pulled Ethan toward the back hallway, toward his room, but Gunnar blocked the path. The dog looked at Maggie, then deliberately moved to the back door, pawing at it insistently. "He wants us to run," Ethan translated, understanding the dog's intent as if they shared a language. "Now, before whoever's coming gets here." "It's a storm," Maggie protested. But even as she spoke, she was grabbing coats from the closet, shoving Ethan's arms into sleeves. "It's -20 out there, visibility is nothing, and it's the middle of the night." "Would you rather face Marcus?" Ethan asked, and the question held a weight that made Maggie's decision for her. She threw on her own coat, grabbed the emergency bag she'd kept packed for 7 years, always ready, never used, and followed the dogs to the back door. Through the window, she could see headlights now, turning onto their street. Not one vehicle, but 2. Marcus hadn't come alone. "The coordinates," Ethan said urgently. "How far?" 85 miles north, Maggie replied, already knowing it was impossible, already knowing they'd try anyway. "Through mountain passes that'll be impassable in this weather, even if we had a vehicle." "Agnes's truck," Ethan interrupted. "She parks it out back. She told me once, if you ever need it, keys are under the mat." Of course Agnes knew. Agnes had always known more than she let on. The old woman next door, who'd been Maggie's closest confidant, who'd helped her through the darkest days after Michael's disappearance, who'd watched over Ethan like he was her own grandson. She'd been part of the plan all along. The dogs were already out the back door, moving through the snow with purpose. Gunnar led the way to Agnes's property, where her ancient pickup truck sat covered in white. As promised, the keys were there. As Maggie swept snow from the windshield, she saw Agnes's kitchen light flick on, saw the old woman's face in the window. Agnes raised one hand, not a wave, but a blessing, and then deliberately turned away, giving them plausible deniability. "Get in," Maggie commanded. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat while the 6 dogs leaped into the truck bed with practiced ease, as if they'd trained for this exact scenario. Perhaps they had. Perhaps every day of the past 7 years had been preparation for this moment. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing and sputtering before catching. Maggie didn't turn on the headlights, navigating by memory and moonlight filtered through storm clouds. Behind them, she could see Marcus's SUV pulling up to their house, could imagine him discovering their absence, could picture his rage and desperation mounting. "He'll follow," Ethan said quietly, clutching the letter from his father against his chest. "Won't he?" "Yes," Maggie replied, gunning the engine as they hit the main road heading north. "But we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" Maggie glanced in the rear-view mirror at the 6 sets of eyes reflecting the faint light, at the loyal guardians who'd waited 7 years for this exact moment. "We have your father's army, and they know the way home." The storm swallowed them whole, and the real journey began. The first 30 miles disappeared behind them in a blur of white and terror. Maggie gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went bone white, her eyes straining to distinguish road from ditch in the chaotic darkness. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the onslaught of snow, but they were fighting a losing battle. Visibility had shrunk to maybe 15 feet on a good stretch, less when the wind gusted and turned the world into a solid wall of white. Ethan sat rigid in the passenger seat, the collar still clutched in his hands like a talisman, his father's letter folded carefully in his coat pocket. In the truck bed, the 6 dogs had arranged themselves in a tight formation, their bodies pressed together for warmth, their eyes scanning the darkness behind them for pursuit. Every few minutes, Gunner would bark once, a short, sharp sound that carried through the storm, and Maggie knew without being told that it meant, "Keep going, we're still clear." "Talk to me," Maggie said, after 20 minutes of silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Tell me what you remember. Everything." Ethan's voice came out small, almost lost beneath the howl of wind and the struggling engine. "I was 4 months old, but I remember, I don't know how, maybe because it was so terrible, maybe because some part of me knew I had to remember. We were at the house, the old house, before we moved to Agnes's street. It was late. Dad was on the phone, pacing, upset. He kept saying, 'I can't let it go, Marcus. These are children. Someone has to stop it.'" Maggie's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. "Then Marcus came to the house. I was in my crib in the living room. I could see them through the bars. They were arguing. Marcus was crying, showing Dad pictures of a boy, saying, 'He's dying, Michael. Tyler's dying, and I don't have the money. They'll pay for the operation if I just look the other way.' And Dad said, 'I can't let you do that. You know I can't.' And Marcus said, 'Then I can't let you stop me.'" The truck hit a patch of ice, and Maggie fought to keep it on the road, her heart hammering. When she regained control, Ethan continued as if there'd been no interruption. "There was shouting, and then a gun. Marcus had a gun. Mom." He stopped, looked at Maggie. "My real mom. She ran in from the kitchen. She threw herself between them. The gun went off, but it hit Dad in the shoulder, not the chest. He fell down. There was blood everywhere. Mom was screaming, and then Marcus's phone rang, and he answered it, and someone told him, 'Bring the cop. We'll keep him as insurance. Make it look like an accident.'" Maggie's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them back furiously. She couldn't afford to crash, not now. And then what? Then other men came. They took Dad. Marcus told Mom that if she said anything, they'd kill her and me both. He said they'd make it look like Dad died in the line of duty, that she should go along with it if she wanted to live. Mom was holding me, crying, and Dad, even bleeding, even being dragged away. He looked at us and mouthed, "I love you. I'll survive. Protect Ethan." "Your mother," Maggie whispered. "What happened to her?" Marcus made her get in a car. Said they needed to stage things properly. The dogs, they were there. All 6 of them, Dad's K9 unit. They went crazy when the men took Dad. Gunner bit one of them. Bear tried to block the door, but Marcus shot in the air and screamed that he'd kill the dogs if they didn't back down, so they did. They backed down, but they didn't stop watching. The truck climbed into the foothills now, the road getting steeper, more treacherous. Maggie downshifted, feeling the tires struggle for purchase. "And you? How did you end up with me?" "You came the next day," Ethan said. "With police. With Reverend Whitmore. They told a story. That Mom died in childbirth a year earlier, that I was Dad's son from his first marriage, that you were the late wife's sister coming to take guardianship. Everyone believed it because Dad had prepared documents, had created a whole false history. The dogs stayed because they were police property, being retired to family care. But really, your father had arranged everything before the confrontation," Maggie finished. He knew Marcus was compromised. He knew it might come to violence. So he created a contingency plan, and I was part of it. She glanced at Ethan, this boy she'd raised as a nephew while loving him as a son. Your real mother. She was taken somewhere that night and told if she ever came back, you'd die. She's out there somewhere, Ethan, thinking you're safer without her, living with the grief of a child she had to abandon. Where? Ethan asked, his voice breaking. I don't know. Your father didn't tell me, said it was safer if I didn't know. But he promised me she was alive, that when this was over, when the trafficking ring was destroyed, she could come back, that we'd be a family again. Maggie's voice hardened. That's what this has all been about. Not just surviving, waiting for the right time to strike back. Behind them, faint through the storm, headlights appeared. Gunner's bark changed. 2 sharp sounds this time. Danger closing in. He's coming, Ethan said unnecessarily. Maggie pressed the accelerator, but the old truck was already giving everything it had. The mountain pass loomed ahead, a narrow road that switchbacked up the steepest part of the route. In good weather, it was treacherous. In this storm, it was near suicidal. But the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant confrontation with a desperate man who'd already proven willing to destroy lives. There's a ranger station, Maggie said, thinking out loud. About mile 47. It's been abandoned for years, but there's shelter, maybe supplies, we could... Ethan shook his head. No stopping. The letter said run north. The dogs know the way. We have to trust them. As if in response, Duchess leaped from the truck bed onto the roof of the cab, her claws scrabbling for purchase. She pressed her face against the windshield, barking urgently, then jumped down and ran ahead into the darkness. A moment later she reappeared, barking again, leading them to a turn Maggie had almost missed, a logging road, barely visible, that branched off from the main highway. She wants us to follow, Ethan said. It's a different route. Maggie hesitated only a second before wrenching the wheel, sending the truck sliding onto the narrower path. The logging road was rough, full of ruts hidden beneath the snow, but it was also less exposed to the wind. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked some of the storm's fury. Your father trained them for this, Maggie realized. He mapped out multiple routes, taught them the alternatives. They've been waiting to guide us. The headlights behind them continued on the main highway, missing the turn. They'd bought themselves time, maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. Marcus would realize his mistake and backtrack, and when he did, he'd be even more desperate. An hour into the journey, the truck's engine began to make a sound that turned Maggie's blood to ice, a rhythmic knocking that spoke of serious mechanical distress. The temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone. They were overheating despite the frigid air, the old engine protesting the strain of snow and steep grades. How much farther? Ethan asked. Maybe 40 miles, Maggie replied, but we're not going to make it in this truck. The engine's dying. As if on cue, steam began hissing from under the hood. Maggie coasted to a stop in a small clearing, her mind racing through impossible options. They were in the middle of nowhere, in a blizzard, with a 7-year-old child and 6 dogs being pursued by armed men. The rational choice was to turn back, to face Marcus, and try to reason with him, to hope that 7 years had softened him, or that he'd balk at hurting a child. But Ethan's memories and Michael's letter had made one thing clear. Marcus was past reason, past mercy. His son was dying, and he'd decided that one innocent life was worth trading for another. There would be no negotiating. We walk, Ethan said simply, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world. Ethan, it's 20 below zero, 40 miles through mountain terrain. The dogs will keep us warm. They'll know the way. And Dad's waiting. The boy's face was set with a determination that was heartbreaking in its absolute certainty. We didn't come this far to give up. Maggie looked at the 6 dogs, now all standing in the truck bed, looking at her with what could only be called expectation. They'd been bred for endurance, trained for harsh conditions, and they'd spent 7 years preparing for this journey. And in their eyes, she saw something else. Michael's plan had accounted for this too. Of course it had. Michael had been nothing if not thorough. From the emergency bag, she pulled out 2 pairs of snowshoes she'd packed years ago on Michael's insistence, along with thermal blankets, hand warmers, and energy bars. There were also dog booties, small protective covers for paws, which she'd thought were paranoid overkill. Now she understood. Michael had planned for the truck to fail. He'd known they'd have to make part of the journey on foot, that the final approach would require silence and stealth that no vehicle could provide. "Your father thought of everything," she murmured, strapping snowshoes to Ethan's feet. "He had 7 years to plan," Ethan replied, "and nothing else to think about except getting us to him." They abandoned the truck, taking only what they could carry. The dogs immediately formed a new configuration. Gunner and Bear in front breaking trail through the deep snow, Scout and Duchess flanking them, Lady staying within inches of Ethan, and Ghost bringing up the rear, watching for pursuit. It was a formation built for protection and efficiency, and they moved through it like a well-oiled machine. The walking was brutal. Even with snowshoes, each step required enormous effort, plunging through drifts that sometimes reached Ethan's waist. The wind cut through their layers of clothing like knives of ice, and the darkness was absolute except for the faint glow of snow that seemed to generate its own ghostly light. But the dogs pressed on, taking turns breaking trail, their bodies creating warmth when they pressed close during brief rest stops. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, Ghost's warning bark cut through the night, 3 sharp sounds. Marcus had found the abandoned truck and was following their trail. In the snow, they were easy to track, and a man traveling light could move faster than a woman and child burdened with supplies and exhaustion. "We need to split up," Maggie said, hating the words even as she spoke them. "I'll lead them away. You take the dogs and go north. The dogs will get you there." "No." Ethan's refusal was absolute. "That's not the plan. We stay together." "Ethan, be reasonable." "Together," he repeated, and suddenly his voice carried an authority that seemed borrowed from Michael himself. "That's what Dad would say. Family doesn't split up. We're stronger together." Gunner barked once, agreeing, and the other dogs pressed closer. They wouldn't leave, wouldn't allow separation. They'd been given one mission 7 years ago. Protect the boy and bring him home, and they would fulfill it or die trying. So they pressed on, moving as fast as they could while knowing it wasn't fast enough. The dogs began a new tactic. Scout and Ghost would fall back periodically, then return with snow-covered muzzles and satisfied expressions. They were obscuring the trail where they could, using their bodies to sweep snow over footprints, creating false trails that branched off into dead ends. It would slow Marcus down, but only temporarily. 2 hours in, Ethan stumbled and went down hard. Maggie pulled him up, felt the trembling in his small body that spoke of exhaustion and hypothermia's early stages. They'd been moving for nearly 3 hours in sub-zero temperatures, and even with the dog's warmth and the thermal gear, it was taking its toll. "I can't," Ethan whispered, and the admission seemed to break something in him. "I'm sorry. I can't keep going." Lady moved to his side immediately, lying down in the snow. Bear did the same on his other side. Without being directed, the other dogs formed a windbreak, their bodies creating a small shelter. They were telling Maggie to rest, that they'd stand guard, that even a few minutes would help. Maggie wrapped Ethan in the thermal blanket and held him close, sharing body heat while the dogs maintained their vigil. Her mind drifted to Michael, imagining him in his cabin prison, probably looking out into this same storm, wondering if they were coming, if his plan had worked, if he'd sacrificed 7 years for nothing. Tell me about him," Ethan said through chattering teeth. "Tell me about Dad. Real things, not the things everyone else knows." So Maggie talked, keeping Ethan conscious and fighting the cold with memories. He proposed to your mother on the dock at Clear Lake. It was sunset, and he'd arranged for the 6 dogs, they were puppies then, just rescued from the fighting ring, to each wear a ribbon with one letter. Together they spelled, "Marry me." Your mother laughed so hard she cried, and she said yes before he even got the ring out. "The dogs were there from the beginning," Ethan murmured. "The dogs have been part of this family since they were born," Maggie confirmed. "Michael rescued them from hell, and they've been repaying that debt ever since. Especially to you. You're the son of the man who saved them. In their eyes, protecting you isn't just duty, it's honor." Gunner's sharp bark brought them back to reality. One bark, all clear for now. But in the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of someone calling out. Marcus, close enough now that his voice carried. "We have to move," Maggie said, pulling Ethan to his feet. His eyes were clearer now, the brief rest having restored some strength. They'd been traveling for 3 hours and covered maybe 8 miles, not nearly enough, but more than she'd dared hope. As they started forward again, Ethan spoke, his voice stronger. "When we get to Dad, what happens then?" "Then we give him the evidence he needs to finish what he started," Maggie replied. "And we bring down everyone who's hurt this family. Marcus, the trafficking ring, everyone who's profited from stolen children and broken families. We make it stop." "And my real mom?" Maggie's heart clenched. "Then we find her. We bring her home. And we become the family we were always meant to be." The dogs surged forward with renewed purpose as if they'd understood every word and approved. Gunner's collar gleamed in what little light penetrated the storm, a reminder of the promise it had held, the key to everything they'd lost and everything they were fighting to regain. Behind them, Marcus's voice called out again, closer now. "Maggie, I know you can hear me. You don't understand. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just need what Michael took. My son is dying. Please!" The plea in his voice was real, the desperation genuine. But so was the threat. Marcus might not want to hurt them, but he would. Desperation had a way of turning good men into monsters, and Marcus had crossed that line 7 years ago. "Don't listen," Ethan said, reading Maggie's hesitation. "He made his choice. We're making ours." They walked on into the storm, 6 dogs and 2 humans bound together by love and loyalty and the unshakable belief that somewhere ahead, in a cabin hidden in the wilderness, Michael Cole was waiting for his family to bring him home. The cabin appeared like a mirage through the swirling snow, a dark shape that materialized so suddenly that Maggie thought exhaustion was making her hallucinate. But Gunner's excited bark and the way all 6 dogs surged forward confirmed it was real. They'd been walking for 6 brutal hours, covering the remaining distance through sheer willpower and the dogs' relentless guidance. Dawn was breaking somewhere beyond the storm clouds, turning the world from black to gray, and there, nestled in a small valley surrounded by pine trees, was the place where Michael Cole had spent 7 years waiting. It wasn't much to look at, a small log structure, weathered and rough, with a roof heavy with snow and windows shuttered against the cold. Smoke rose from a crude chimney, the only sign of life in the frozen wilderness. The coordinates from Gunner's collar had led them true, through mountain passes and hidden trails that no vehicle could have managed, to this secret place that existed on no map. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the cabin with an expression that mingled hope and terror. "He's in there," he whispered. "After all this time, he's really in there." Maggie squeezed his shoulder, her own emotions a tangled knot too complex to name. 7 years of believing Michael was dead, then learning he was alive, then racing through a blizzard to reach him, and now the moment of truth was here, and she found herself afraid. Afraid of what 7 years of imprisonment had done to him. Afraid he wouldn't recognize them. Afraid that after everything they'd arrived too late. The dogs had no such hesitation. They rushed the cabin, pawing at the heavy wooden door, barking in a chorus that would wake the dead. Lady stood on her hind legs, scratching frantically. Bear threw his weight against the door, making it shudder, and Gunner, disciplined, controlled Gunner, let out a howl that carried all the longing and loyalty of 7 years of waiting. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then came the sound of bolts being drawn back, of chains rattling, of locks clicking open. The door swung inward, and there, backlit by firelight, stood a figure that barely resembled the man in Maggie's memories. Michael Cole had been 38 when he disappeared, a strong and vital man with dark hair and clear eyes, and a presence that commanded respect. The man in the doorway was a ghost of that person, gaunt to the point of skeletal, with hair and beard gone completely white, his skin pale as paper, his body bent as if carrying an invisible weight. He wore layers of ragged clothing, his hands wrapped in strips of cloth for warmth, and when he looked at them his eyes took a moment to focus, as if he'd forgotten how to process the sight of other human beings. "Gunner," he said, his voice rough from disuse, cracking on the single word. The dog launched himself at his former handler, nearly knocking the weakened man over. Michael caught himself against the doorframe, his hands shaking violently, burying themselves in Gunner's fur. "Old boy, you're so old. How can you be so old?" Then his gaze lifted to Ethan, and the world seemed to stop. 4 months, Michael whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You were 4 months old. You were a baby. I left a baby, and now—" His voice broke entirely. "Ethan!" Ethan couldn't speak. 7 years of waiting, of silence, of carrying memories no child should have to bear, all of it crashed down on him at once. He stood trembling in the snow, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stare at the father who'd become a stranger. It was Maggie who bridged the gap, gently pushing Ethan forward. "Go to him, sweetheart. Go to your dad." Ethan took one step, then another, and then he was running, stumbling through the snow, falling, getting up, running again. Michael collapsed to his knees, arms outstretched, and when they collided, when father and son embraced for the first time in 7 years, the sound Michael made was barely human, a sob torn from somewhere so deep that it seemed to come from his very soul. "My boy," Michael gasped, clutching Ethan as if he might disappear. "My beautiful boy, you came. You found me. I knew you would. I knew the dogs would bring you. I knew—" But words failed him, and he could only hold his son and weep. Ethan buried his face in his father's shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm sorry it took so long. I tried to understand, tried to be old enough, tried to be strong enough." "Shh," Michael soothed, stroking Ethan's hair with trembling hands. "You did perfect. You did everything right. 7 years old and you found me. 7 years old and you brought yourself and Maggie through a blizzard. You're the bravest person I've ever known." Michael looked up at Maggie then, still kneeling in the snow, still holding Ethan. His eyes held recognition and something deeper, gratitude, love, and an apology for everything he'd put them through. "Maggie, you kept him safe. You kept the secret. I asked the impossible of you, and you—" "I'd do it again," Maggie said fiercely, moving forward to join them, wrapping her arms around both of them. "1,000 times over, for this family, for you both." They stayed like that for long minutes. 3 people bound by love and sacrifice, while 6 dogs pressed close, their mission finally fulfilled. The storm continued to rage around them, but in that small circle of reunion there was only warmth and relief and the overwhelming joy of a family torn apart and somehow impossibly brought back together. Finally, Michael pulled back, cupping Ethan's face in his hands, studying every feature as if memorizing it. "Let me look at you. Really look at you. 7 years old. You have your mother's eyes and her courage." His expression faltered. "Does he know?" he asked Maggie. "About his real mother? About what happened to her?" "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tears still streaming down his face. "I remember that night, all of it. Marcus with the gun, Mom being taken, the lies to keep us safe, Maggie pretending to be my aunt. All of it." Michael closed his eyes as if in pain. "You weren't supposed to remember. You were so young. The trauma was supposed to block it out." "Maybe I remembered because I had to," Ethan said simply. "Because forgetting would have meant you stayed lost forever." A sound in the distance, a shout barely audible over the wind, shattered the moment. Marcus. He'd followed their trail, and he was close. The dogs reacted instantly, forming their protective barrier, hackles raised, teeth bared. Michael's expression hardened, transformed from broken man to the police officer he'd once been. "How many?" he asked Maggie. "At least Marcus. Maybe Deputy Hatcher." They were both in Silver Point. Michael nodded, pulling himself to his feet with visible effort. He was weak, clearly malnourished, but there was steel in his spine that 7 years hadn't broken. "Get inside. All of you. There's a root cellar beneath the floor. Ethan, you and Maggie hide there with the dogs. I'll handle this." "No," Ethan said, the word sharp and final. "No more hiding. No more lies. No more separating. We face this together, or we don't face it at all." Michael looked at his son, this 7-year-old child who'd survived trauma and silence and a journey through hell, and saw not a boy who needed protection, but a warrior who'd earned the right to stand his ground. "Together," he agreed, the word both a concession and a benediction. They moved inside the cabin, Michael bolting the door behind them. The interior was sparse. A cot, a makeshift kitchen, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies, and in the corner a table covered with papers. Evidence. 7 years of meticulously gathered information about the trafficking ring, about the corrupt officials who enabled it, about every crime and every victim. This was what Marcus had come for. This was what Michael had protected at the cost of everything. "He'll try to negotiate," Michael said, moving to the window, watching the woods for movement. "He'll promise anything if I give him this." He gestured to the evidence. "His son's life depends on it. The trafficking ring promised him money for the treatment, but only if he kept me silent, kept the evidence buried." "Will you give it to him?" Maggie asked. Michael's jaw tightened. "I spent 7 years in this prison so that evidence could bring down monsters who steal children and sell them like cattle. I've missed 7 years of my son's life for this. I won't surrender it to save one life if it means destroying thousands more." "Even if Marcus's son is innocent?" Ethan asked quietly. "He's just a kid like me. He didn't ask for his dad to do bad things." The question hit Michael like a physical blow. His son, 7 years old and already grappling with the impossible moral complexities that had driven men like Marcus to destruction. "No," Michael said softly. "He didn't. And that's the cruelty of it. There's no clean answer here. No choice that doesn't leave someone suffering." Outside, footsteps crunched through snow. The dogs growled low and threatening, and Marcus Brennan's voice, desperate and broken, called out through the storm, "Michael, I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. Please, please, we need to talk. My son is dying. 7 years, Michael. 7 years of guilt and nightmares. Let's end this. Let's find a way for everyone to survive." Michael's hand tightened on Ethan's shoulder. "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, stay behind me." But Ethan stepped forward, moved to the window, and looked out at the man who'd shattered their family. When he spoke, his voice carried through the cabin with a clarity that surprised them all. "He's right, Dad. It needs to end. All of it. The hiding, the revenge, the pain. It all needs to end." And with that, Ethan Cole, silent for 7 years, walked toward the door. Michael moved to grab Ethan, to pull him back from the door, but Maggie caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Trust him. He's been waiting 7 years for this moment. He's earned the right to face it." Ethan stood at the door, his small hand on the bolt, and took a deep breath. Then he opened it wide, stepping out into the gray dawn light with 6 German shepherds flowing around him like dark water. 20 feet away, Marcus Brennan stood in the snow, his weapon lowered, his face a mask of exhaustion and desperation. Deputy Roy Hatcher stood beside him, looking like a man who'd walked through his own grave and found no peace on the other side. "Hello, Marcus," Ethan said, his voice clear and strong. "I remember you. I remember everything." Marcus's face crumpled. "Ethan. God, Ethan, you were just a baby. You can't possibly—" "I remember you shooting my father," Ethan continued, each word deliberate. "I remember my mother screaming. I remember you saying your son was dying and you'd do anything to save him. I remember being 4 months old and watching you choose your family over mine." "I didn't have a choice." Marcus's voice broke, tears streaming down his face. "Tyler was 3 years old, stage 4 leukemia. The doctors said experimental treatment in Switzerland was his only hope. $200,000 we didn't have. The trafficking ring offered me that money. All I had to do was look the other way, help them move product across the border. I thought I could do it without anyone getting hurt. I thought I could save my son and keep my soul." "But you couldn't," Michael said, emerging from the cabin, looking like death itself but standing straight. "Because evil doesn't let you keep your soul, Marcus. It takes it in pieces until there's nothing left." Marcus raised his weapon, but his hand shook so violently that the gun wavered. "I don't want to hurt anyone else. God knows I've hurt enough people, but I need that evidence, Michael. It's the only leverage I have left. The trafficking ring collapsed 3 years ago. FBI raids, mass arrests. But my involvement never came to light because you disappeared with the proof. Now Tyler needs another transplant. I'm broke, I'm desperate, and I need to sell that evidence to the highest bidder. Rival criminals, foreign governments, anyone who'll pay enough to save my son." "So you'd let other children suffer," Maggie said, moving to stand beside Michael, "so yours can live?" "Yes!" Marcus screamed, the word torn from him like a confession. "Yes, I would burn the world down to save my son. Wouldn't you? Wouldn't any parent?" He looked at Michael. "Tell me you wouldn't have done the same for Ethan." Michael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone listen. "I spent 7 years in that cabin, Marcus. 7 years with nothing but time to think about choices and consequences. And yes, there were nights I thought I'd do anything, betray anyone, hurt anyone, just to hold my son again. But here's what I learned. Real love doesn't destroy others to save its own. Real love sacrifices itself. That's easy to say when your son is standing right there, healthy and whole." Marcus's gun steadied, pointing directly at Michael. "My son is in a hospital bed, fading away because I can't afford the treatment that would save him. You kept me from the money 7 years ago. You've kept me from it ever since. How many nights has Tyler cried himself to sleep because his father failed him? How many times has he asked me, Daddy, am I going to die? And I've had to lie and say no? Ethan took a step forward, and the dogs moved with him. Where is he, your son? Where is Tyler? Marcus blinked, thrown by the question. What? Where is he right now? Which hospital? St. Mary's in Billings. Why does that? Because I want to meet him, Ethan said simply. I want to meet the boy whose life my father's evidence costs. I want to see if he's worth all this pain. Ethan, no, Maggie started, but Ethan held up his hand. Dad spent 7 years alone so that evidence could save people. You've spent 7 years hurting people to save your son, but nobody's actually asked Tyler what he wants, have they? Nobody's asked the kid at the center of all this what he thinks is worth his life. Marcus lowered the gun slightly, confusion replacing desperation on his face. He's 12 years old. He doesn't understand. I'm 7, and I understand plenty, Ethan interrupted. I understand that my silence kept my family safe. I understand that my father's sacrifice protected hundreds of victims. I understand that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. He paused, then added softly, I bet Tyler understands that too. The words hung in the frozen air like a challenge. Hatcher, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward. The boy's right, Marcus. We never asked Tyler. We never gave him the choice to live with the cost of what we've done. We just decided his life was worth more than our souls. He's my son, Marcus roared. I'm his father. It's my job to protect him, to save him, to make the hard choices he can't make. And it was my job to protect Ethan, Michael replied, his voice steady despite the physical trembling that betrayed his weakness. But I gave him the truth. I trusted him with the weight of it. I let him carry it because I believed he was strong enough. And look at him now, 7 years old and braver than both of us combined. Marcus's face twisted with anguish. He looked from Michael to Ethan, from the evidence he'd spent 7 years hunting to the future he'd destroyed to create. The gun dipped further, his resolve crumbling like sand. Then, from the forest behind them, came the sound of engines, multiple vehicles pushing through the snow. Headlights appeared through the trees and voices called out. Marcus's face went white with terror. FBI! Hatcher hissed. Someone must have... He looked at Maggie, realization dawning. You called them. Before you left Silver Point. Maggie nodded. Reverend Whitmore has had instructions for 7 years. If we ever ran, if Michael's location was ever revealed, he was to contact the authorities with all the evidence Michael had already sent him. Copies of everything, held in trust, waiting for this day. You never needed the evidence in that cabin, Ethan said to Marcus, understanding flooding his young face. Dad already made sure it reached the right people. You've been chasing a ghost. Marcus fell to his knees in the snow, the weapon dropping from nerveless fingers. Then it's over. It's all over. Tyler won't get his treatment. He'll die, and it'll be my fault. Everything I've done, all the lives I've ruined, it was all for nothing. Michael moved forward slowly, painfully, until he stood over Marcus. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Michael reached down and lifted Marcus to his feet with surprising gentleness. It's not over, Michael said quietly. The evidence I gathered, it didn't just expose the trafficking ring. It revealed millions of dollars in seized assets, money taken from criminals who preyed on the innocent. That money is supposed to go to victim compensation funds. He paused, letting the words sink in. Tyler is a victim too, Marcus, not of trafficking, but of the evil that forced his father to make impossible choices. I've already made arrangements. When the authorities arrive, I'll testify that some of those funds should go to families like yours, people who were caught in the machinery of this evil without intending to be part of it. Marcus stared at Michael as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. You'd help Tyler after everything I've done to you? To your family? I'm not doing it for you, Michael said, his voice hard. I'm doing it for a 12-year-old boy who doesn't deserve to pay for his father's sins. I'm doing it because Ethan taught me that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. And I'm doing it because somewhere out there, there's a woman, Ethan's real mother, who spent 7 years thinking her son is better off without her. When she comes home, I want her to find a family that chose mercy over hatred. The FBI vehicles burst into the clearing, agents pouring out with weapons drawn. Marcus raised his hands immediately, surrendering without resistance. Hatcher did the same, relief and regret mingling on his weathered face. As Marcus was being handcuffed, he looked back at Ethan. "Your son," he said to Michael, "he's extraordinary. He's better than both of us ever were." "I know," Michael replied, pulling Ethan close with one arm while Maggie pressed against his other side. "He had 7 years to learn how to be strong, and 6 teachers who never let him forget what loyalty and love look like." He looked down at the dogs who'd finally relaxed their guard, tails wagging slightly as they sensed the danger had passed. The lead FBI agent approached, recognition flashing across his face. "Officer Cole? Michael Cole? Sir, we thought you were dead." "I was," Michael said tiredly, leaning heavily on Maggie as his strength finally gave out. "For 7 years, I was dead. But my family brought me back." As Michael collapsed, agents rushing forward to help as emergency medical personnel were called as the machinery of justice began to turn. Ethan stood in the snow watching it all. He thought about his real mother, somewhere out there, waiting to come home. He thought about Tyler, the boy he'd never met but whose life was now entangled with his own. He thought about Marcus, who'd loved his son enough to destroy himself, but not wisely enough to save him the right way. And he thought about his father, who'd sacrificed 7 years of life for a principle, for justice, for the belief that some things were worth more than personal happiness. As they loaded Michael onto a stretcher, as Maggie climbed in beside him, Ethan heard his father's weak voice calling his name. He ran to the stretcher, grabbed his father's hand. "I'm here, Dad. I'm right here." "You saved me," Michael whispered, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "Not just by finding me. By reminding me why I did this, by being the kind of person worth sacrificing for." His grip tightened. "Your mother would be so proud. Both of them would be." The agents insisted they needed to transport Michael immediately. 7 years without proper nutrition and medical care had taken a devastating toll. As they loaded him into the helicopter that had managed to land in the clearing, Ethan refused to let go of his hand. "We're not separating again," Ethan said firmly. "We're family. We stay together." The agent looked at Maggie, who nodded. "The boy's right. We stay together. After 7 years, we've earned that much." As the helicopter lifted off, as Silver Point fell away beneath them, as the storm finally began to clear, Ethan looked at his father, weak but alive, broken but healing, and felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Not just hope, but certainty. They'd survived the worst. Now they'd build something better from the wreckage. Below them, 6 German shepherds stood in the snow, watching their family fly away to safety, their 7-year mission finally complete. Gunner's collar gleamed in the emerging sunlight, empty now of its secret but full of the promise it had kept. 3 days after the rescue, Michael Cole lay in a hospital bed in Billings, Montana, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred, monitoring the body that had somehow survived 7 years of deprivation. The doctors called it a miracle that he was alive at all. Severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, muscle atrophy, and a heart condition that should have killed him months ago. Yet here he was, weak but breathing, broken but mending. What the doctors couldn't explain, what defied their medical understanding, was the change that occurred on the fourth day. Michael's heart, which had been failing, which had shown all the signs of irreversible damage, suddenly began to strengthen. His rhythm stabilized, his blood pressure normalized. It was as if his body, given permission to live again, to fight again, had decided it wasn't finished yet. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, the cardiologist explained to Maggie, using the technical term. Broken heart syndrome. Emotional trauma can literally damage the heart muscle, but in rare cases, when the emotional state changes dramatically, when hope returns, when love is restored, the heart can heal itself. It's not common, but it happens. Your husband's reunion with his family may have saved his life in ways we can't fully measure. Ethan spent every possible moment at his father's bedside, holding his hand, telling him stories about the 7 years they'd lost. Michael listened with tears streaming down his face as his son described first days of school, lost teeth, nightmares conquered, and the unwavering presence of 6 dogs who'd kept their promise every single day. On the 5th day, Michael was strong enough to sit up, and they had a visitor. Tyler Brennan arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by his grandmother, his 12-year-old body frail from illness, but his eyes bright with curiosity. Ethan had requested the meeting, and after much deliberation, the adults had agreed. "You're the boy," Tyler said softly, looking at Ethan. "The one my dad hurt." "And you're the boy he hurt for," Ethan replied, moving closer. "We're both victims, I guess." Tyler looked at Michael, fear and shame warring on his young face. "I'm sorry for what my dad did to you. I didn't know, not until a few days ago. They told me you died in the line of duty 7 years ago. Then the FBI came and said my dad that he'd been—" The boy couldn't finish. "Your father loves you," Michael said, his voice still rough but gaining strength. "He made terrible choices, but they came from real love. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. And Tyler, you are not responsible for your father's sins." "But I'm the reason," Tyler whispered. "If I wasn't sick, if I didn't need the treatment, he wouldn't have—" "No," Ethan interrupted firmly. "My dad taught me something. He said real love doesn't destroy others to save its own. Your dad forgot that." "But that's not your fault. You didn't ask to be sick. You didn't ask him to do bad things. You're just a kid who needed help." The two boys looked at each other, mirror images of innocence caught in the machinery of adult choices and consequences. Then, without speaking, they moved together, and Tyler leaned down from his wheelchair to hug Ethan. They held each other while their families watched, 2 children finding solidarity in shared pain. "The FBI," Michael said to Tyler's grandmother. "They're arranging for the Victim Compensation Fund to cover Tyler's treatment. All of it. The bone marrow transplant, the follow-up care, everything. It won't be immediate, but it will happen. Your grandson will get the care he needs." The elderly woman's face crumpled with relief and gratitude. "Why? After what Marcus did to you, why would you help us?" Michael looked at Ethan, then back at her. "Because my son taught me that justice and mercy can coexist. Because breaking the cycle of pain starts with someone choosing to heal instead of hurt. And because Tyler deserves a future, regardless of what his father did." Tyler's grandmother wept, thanking them over and over until words became meaningless. When they left, Tyler looked back at Ethan one last time. "When I get better," he said, "can we be friends? Real friends?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, smiling for the first time in days. "I'd like that." Over the following weeks, Michael's recovery progressed faster than anyone had predicted. The hospital became a gathering place for people whose lives had intersected with the Cole family's story. Agnes Murphy arrived from Silver Point with half the town in tow, bringing casseroles and blankets and fierce love. Reverend Whitmore came to pray and to confess his own 7 years of burden, holding Michael's secrets, watching Maggie suffer, keeping faith that the plan would work. The 6 German shepherds were housed temporarily in a facility near the hospital, but they grew increasingly agitated, separated from Ethan. Finally, the hospital administrator, a dog lover himself, made an unprecedented exception. The dogs were allowed to visit under strict supervision, and when they entered Michael's room, the reunion was as powerful as any human embrace. Gunnar laid his head on Michael's bed and didn't move for an hour. Lady pressed against Ethan's legs as if verifying he was still there. And Michael ran his hands through their fur, whispering thanks for keeping his family safe when he couldn't. It was on the 30th day of Michael's hospitalization that the final piece of the puzzle arrived. A woman in her early 40s entered the hospital, escorted by FBI agents, her hands trembling as she walked down the corridor toward Michael's room. She had Ethan's gray eyes and the same shape to her face. She'd been found in a small town in Oregon, living under an assumed name, working as a waitress, believing for 7 years that her son was better off without her. Maggie saw her first through the window in the door. Her sharp intake of breath made Michael turn, and when he saw who stood in the hallway, tears sprang to his eyes. "Go get Ethan," he whispered to Maggie. "Quickly, bring him here." Ethan was in the hospital cafeteria with Tyler when Maggie found him. "Come with me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Someone's here. Someone who's been waiting 7 years to see you." They walked back to Michael's room together, and when Ethan saw the woman standing there, this stranger who wasn't a stranger, whose face he knew from fragments of memory and dreams, he stopped in his tracks. "Ethan," Michael said gently, "this is Sarah. Your mother. Your real mother." Sarah dropped to her knees, her face streaming with tears. "My baby," she whispered. "My beautiful baby boy. And you were so tiny when I last held you, and now you're—" Her voice broke completely. "They told me you were better off without me. They said if I ever tried to find you, they'd kill you. So I stayed away. I stayed away and died a little every day. But I stayed away because I thought it would keep you safe." Ethan stood frozen, processing emotions too large for his 7-year-old frame. He looked at Maggie, the woman who'd raised him, who'd fed him and clothed him and sat with him through 7 years of silence. Then he looked at Sarah, the woman who'd given him life, who'd been forced to abandon him, who'd lived in exile so he could survive. "I have 2 mothers," he said finally, the realization settling over him like a blessing. "One who gave birth to me and one who raised me. And they both loved me enough to break their own hearts to save mine." Sarah and Maggie looked at each other, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them. They'd both sacrificed for this boy, both suffered for him, both loved him with a fierceness that transcended biology. They weren't rivals. They were sisters in the truest sense, bound by shared devotion to the same child. Ethan walked to Sarah, this woman he didn't remember, but somehow knew in his bones. "I'm sorry it took so long to find you," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken to Michael weeks before. "But we're together now. We're all together." Sarah pulled him into her arms, holding her son for the first time in 7 years, feeling his solid weight and his beating heart and the miracle of his existence. "I love you," she sobbed. "I never stopped loving you. Not for 1 second." "I know," Ethan replied. And somehow he did know. He'd always known in the deepest part of himself that he was loved beyond measure by people who'd made impossible sacrifices. The Cole family, fragmented, scattered, broken, was finally whole. 3 months later, Michael was released from the hospital with a clean bill of health that astounded his doctors. The heart that should have failed had healed. The body that should have remained broken had recovered. Love, it seemed, was stronger than medical prognosis. Marcus Brennan was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 8. His testimony had helped close several remaining cases related to the trafficking ring, and the judge had taken into account his cooperation and the extenuating circumstances of his son's illness. Tyler's treatment was fully funded, and early results showed the transplant was successful. The boy wrote to Ethan every week, and Ethan wrote back, two boys building a friendship from the wreckage of their father's choices. Deputy Hatcher received a lighter sentence, 5 years, for his cooperation and his lesser role in the crimes. He spent his time in prison volunteering for rehabilitation programs, trying to atone for the years he'd looked the other way. The Cole family returned to Silver Point, but not to the small house where they'd lived in shadow and secrecy. The town, inspired by their story, had pooled resources to buy them a larger home on the edge of town, one with enough room for Michael, Sarah, Maggie, Ethan, and 6 German shepherds who'd earned their place as full family members. The living arrangement was unconventional. Michael and Sarah in one wing, Maggie in another, all of them co-parenting Ethan in a configuration that made traditional families scratch their heads but worked perfectly for them. They'd learned that family wasn't about conventional structures. It was about people who stayed when everything said run, who loved when everything said hate, who built bridges when everything said burn. On a spring morning, 6 months after the rescue, the Cole family stood in the Silver Point Cemetery at a grave marked Michael Cole, loving father, brave officer. They'd decided to leave it there, not as a deception, but as a memorial to the man who died so another could be born, a man willing to sacrifice everything for justice and love. "Here lies the man who sacrificed everything," the new inscription read. "Here rises the man who gained it all back." Ethan placed flowers on the grave while the 6 dogs sat in respectful silence. "That version of you is gone, Dad," he said, "but I like the version we have now even better." Michael pulled his son close, Sarah and Maggie flanking them, the dogs pressed against their legs. "Me too, buddy. Me too." As they walked back to their car, Ethan turned one last time to look at the grave. He thought about 7 years of silence, 7 years of waiting, 7 years of faith that love would eventually win. And it had. Not easily, not without cost, but completely. That evening, the entire town of Silver Point gathered at the Cole house for a celebration. Tables overflowed with food, children played in the yard, and 6 German shepherds wore flower collars that made them look ridiculous and proud at the same time. Agnes Murphy presided over the festivities like a queen, while Reverend Whitmore said grace over a meal that felt like communion. In the midst of the celebration, Ethan stood on a chair at his parents' request to say a few words. The crowd quieted, waiting to hear from the boy who'd been silent for so long. "My teacher asked us to write an essay about what family means," Ethan began, his voice clear and strong. "I want to share what I wrote." He pulled out a paper and read, "Family isn't who you're born to. It's who stays when everything falls apart. My dad was gone 7 years, but he never left. He was in every dog bark, every protective circle, every lesson I learned without knowing I was learning it. My mom pretended not to be my mom, but she was mom in every meal, every worry, every silent prayer. My other mom gave me up to keep me safe, and loved me from far away until she could love me close again. 6 dogs kept a promise longer than some people keep marriages, and a whole town I barely knew became the family that held us together when we couldn't hold ourselves." He paused, looking around at the faces, young and old, human and canine, that had become his world. "So what is family?" It's the people and souls who refuse to let you fall, even when you don't know they're catching you. It's love that doesn't ask if you deserve it but gives it anyway because that's who they are. It's sacrifice without recognition, loyalty without reward, faith without proof. Tears streamed down faces throughout the crowd. Even the dogs seemed to understand the weight of the moment, sitting still and solemn. "My family was broken," Ethan concluded. "But we put it back together with the strongest glue in the world. We loved each other through the dark until we could see light again. And that's what family does. It survives. It endures. It comes home." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan barely heard it. He was looking at his fathers, Michael in the memory of what he'd sacrificed, his mothers, Sarah and Maggie, who'd both shaped him, and his 6 guardians, who'd never wavered in their mission. As the party continued into the evening, as laughter replaced tears and hope replaced pain, 6 German shepherds lay in a circle around Ethan Cole. Their 7-year watch finally ended, but their devotion unchanged. They'd kept their promise to a man who'd saved them, protecting his greatest treasure until he could return to claim it. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. That was family. To everyone watching who's lived long enough to know that life doesn't always give us the endings we deserve, this story is for you. If you've ever felt invisible in a world that values youth over wisdom, if you've watched your town empty as neighbors moved away and memories faded, if you've held on to hope when everyone said, "let go," then you understand the Cole family's journey. This isn't just a story about a boy and his dogs. It's about what we do when everything we love is taken from us. It's about the quiet heroes, like Agnes and Reverend Whitmore, who stay when others leave, who believe when others doubt, who prove that our later years aren't an ending but a chance to witness miracles we've earned through decades of faith. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of silence, 7 years of loyalty that never wavered. And in the end, love won, not because it was easy, but because people like you, people who understand that real strength comes from enduring, refused to let it die. Your life matters. Your faithfulness matters. Your love still has the power to bring people home. What sacrifice have you made for family that no one knows about? Have you ever had to wait years for something precious to return? Share your story below. Your experience might be the hope someone else desperately needs today.